particularly Seth Caperdale. Who is running for governor, and he certainly is one of the best speakers I've ever heard. And he is certainly one that we're going to continue to work with in this struggle for justice. Today I was asked to come and talk a little bit about racism, the fight against racism, and the struggle for fundamental change. And I also want to recognize my friends here from the NAACP, Deborah and Bruce Lowry. Give them a hand. And there's so many other POW members. If I keep recognizing people, I'll use up all my time. So don't anyone be offended if I didn't call your name or recognize you. I consider you all brothers and sisters in this struggle. And it must be apparent to us, Carol Gay, at this time that we stand at a unique period in contemporary American history. I had never experienced a time like this when you literally wake up in the morning and wonder, what did 45 do this time? And if there's anything that we must do in the next 30 or so months, whether by impeachment, by resignation, by defeat at the ballot box, or any other feasible means, Trump must go. We must get Trump out of there. And Trump is the low-hanging fruit. Because I know I'm speaking to veterans in here tonight. I'm not speaking to people who are novices in the struggle. I look at all of you. I may not know all of you by name, but I've seen you before. The last time I was here in Highland Park, we were standing on the corner. What was that, 27? Yeah. We were standing on the corner of 27, worried about if 45 was going to launch a nuclear attack against North Korea. And so I recognize some of the faces in here tonight that were standing with us, and we were doing the right thing. But 45 is the low-hanging fruit. But logically, you get the low-hanging fruit first, right? I mean, if we can get him, we can get him, one way or the other. I'm not confident that he's going to be impeached because his team is in power. And it is clear that they are willing to go to almost any length to stay in power. They're willing to turn their head and close their eyes to any of the most ridiculous things that he might do in order to stay in power. But there's a lesson in this for us, brothers and sisters, that fundamentally this is a struggle for power. That fundamentally the situation that exists today exists because of the distribution and disposition of the forces of power in the United States. And we must do all that we can, one, to get 45 out, but not just 45. We should start with Trump, go to Pence, and keep impeaching until the whole regime is gone. We got to get that whole regime out of there. The whole group has to go. Because if we impeach Trump, we're going to get what? We're going to get Pence. You know, the right-wing Christian Taliban here in the United States. I mean, really. I mean, if you read Pence's history, I mean, he is a right-wing, white Christian nationalist zealot. And these people, they don't want any of us to have any rights. They don't want civil rights. They don't want women's rights. They don't want workers' rights. They don't want gay people's rights. The only rights that they are fighting to uphold right now are the rights of the Fortune 500 to exploit us to the maximum amount possible. That's the only right that they support right now. And we have to do all that we can to get Trump out of there. You know, during the election of 2016. I mean, when we think about it, if you really think about it, and bear with me, because you all know I'm given to hyperbole and exaggeration from time to time, but bear with me. You know, what we are living under right now in the United States is a white minority regime. That's right. This is a white minority regime. Our situation is comparable to the situation of the people in South Africa. What we have in office is someone who is not elected by the majority of people here in the United States. He was the minority in the contest. He was the one that had the lesser amount of votes. And think about it. We're raised what? I mean, if I say to you democracy, what's the first thing you're going to say? Majority rule. Because in kindergarten, we elect homeroom representatives. Majority rule. We elect the senior class president. Majority rule. We elect the councilmen and the state legislators. Majority rule. We elect the governor. Majority rule. Only when it comes to the president of the United States do we have a little thing over here called the Electoral College, made up of 535 people, equal to the number of people that compose the Senate and the House of Representatives, who can decide over the majority, over 137 million voters, who would be the president of the United States. Imagine if in the next gubernatorial election, we had a little body of people made 2 from each county who decided, no matter what we voted, who the governor was going to be. It's only in the case of the president. And this little group, the Electoral College, is a vestige of the institution of slavery. It was one of those things set up like the U.S. Senate to give the slave-holding states a greater voice in the governance of this country. Because the founding fathers, for all of their proclamations, their glorious proclamations about democracy, all of them were afraid of the masses of the people. So they set up this little thing called the Electoral College to pick the president. And I think that at the top of our agenda should be the abolition of the Electoral College and the direct election of the President of the United States in this country. But that's not an easy task. I mean, all of these things that we look at, it seems like we're in, the Passion. Every Easter they have the Passion of the Christ, right? And no matter where you go, you know what the outcome is going to be. Because we all know the Jesus story, right? The passion of the Christ. And it's like we're constantly replaying the Civil War. And you really can't understand what's going on in the United States today unless you understand the Civil War and its antecedent, the institution of slavery in the United States. Because we constantly come back to this position. Slavery was a national institution. It wasn't just a Southern institution. Slavery wasn't just in Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia and North Carolina and South Carolina. Slavery was right here in New Jersey. The most active slave port on the East Coast wasn't even down south. It was New York City. Wall Street literally is where the auction block was in New York City. And in fact, Wall Street is founded on capital that was accumulated during the slave trade and during the period of slavery in the United States. In 1860, the greatest form of capital, the largest body of capital in the United States, greater than industrial capital and banking capital combined, was the money invested in slavery. 1860, 4 million registered enslaved people in the United States, 12,500 here in New Jersey. And people like to think of New Jersey as a liberal state, but the sentiments were very much pro-slavery in this state. When Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd, 1862, becoming effective January 1st, 1863, the state legislature of New Jersey nullifies Lincoln's power to emancipate slaves in this state. When the 13th Amendment had to be passed, and a 3/4 majority of states was required to amend the Constitution. There were 36 states, 9 of them were in rebellion. You needed 27 to amend the Constitution. Jersey was not in the 27 state majority to abolish slavery. This was the last northern state to abolish slavery by virtue of the passage of the 13th Amendment over the objection. Why was this? Because the political economy of New Jersey was bound up with the political economy of the South. What was Paterson, New Jersey? It was a great textile center. Where did the cotton come from to make the textiles, to make the cloth? It came from the South. The raw goods would come up from the South, come into our factories, be turned into products, sold back to the South. People were making money hand over fist. There was not a lot of sentiment for abolition in New Jersey. And a lot of slaves, when they came to Jersey, they kept going. They knew this wasn't the place to stay. And you know, there are many underground railroad sites all throughout this area. In New Jersey, the church on Broad Street was an underground. In fact, you can tour today the tunnel that they would hide the enslaved people in. But this was a state whose sentiments were very much pro-slavery. And after slavery, it was a state whose sentiments was very much in favor of segregation and of Jim Crow. Even to this day, New Jersey is one of the most racially segregated states in the Union. We're about 6th in housing segregation. And our public schools are about the 5th most segregated out of 50 states. Because the sentiment was very much in favor of Jim Crow in this state. And it wasn't just, you know, we talk about Jim Crow, we talking about down south. In my lifetime, and maybe in your lifetime, because I think that I have some peers in this room, right?
I got you.
I'm 63, glad to be here. But in my lifetime, in Newark, New Jersey, we had racially segregated movie theaters. I mean, first of all, they didn't even want you to go downtown. We had movie theaters that we were supposed to go to in our community, like in the black community, in the old 3rd Ward of Newark, there was the National Theater. But if you should go downtown to the RKO Proctors, the Paramount, the Loews, the Branford, the Adams theaters, black people could not sit in the mezzanine. They had to sit in the balcony. This was in my lifetime. This is not something from a dusty history book, Seth. This is in my lifetime. This was a very racially segregated state. Even Newark, New Jersey. We had apartheid in Newark. We had a majority black city ruled by a white minority political structure. And it took a rebellion to overthrow that political structure. So we find ourselves in this peculiar place where we've been before. We had a civil war, right? To end slavery. People knew that slavery was wrong. As early as 1625, the Quakers issued the first anti-slavery tract in the United States. People knew that this was wrong, but they was making money. It's all about the money. And we can't get fooled. They've been fooling us and dividing us and conquering us. It's time for us to unite and fight back, brothers and sisters. It's time for us to unite and fight back. It was a civil war. More people died in the more Americans died in the Civil War than in World Wars I, II, Korea, Vietnam combined. It took 1 million lives. And every so often, the historians revise these figures up. Families were divided. Churches were divided. You know, I hate to say this, but, you know, y'all invited me here, so you're going to have to deal with it. You know, most of our, in fact, almost all, in fact, I'll go further and I'll say all of the major denominations, Christian denominations, all of them refused to take a stand against slavery. All of them, except the Quakers. Except the Quakers. I mean, that's how the AME church got started. Because black people wanted to go in to pray with the other Methodists. They said, no, you can't be in here. You know, I guess they figured heaven must be segregated too, right? So Richard Allen, he left and he formed the AME, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. They didn't say the colored Methodists. They didn't say the Negro Methodists. They said the African Methodists because they were clear on their identity. But it took 1 million people. It took 1 million lives. And you know, the North wasn't winning. And finally, Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and Thaddeus Stevens, the radical Republicans, remember back then it was flipped. You know, the Democratic Party was the party of the slaveholders. And the Republican Party was the party that was pro-emancipation to varying degrees. And the radical Republicans, Charles Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens, and others, and Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, they were the radical wing of the Republican Party. And they went to Lincoln and they said, Lincoln, you need to put rifles in the hands of the people that have the greatest vested interest in winning this war. Lincoln thought about it for a minute. He said, I don't know. Y'all might do to us what we did to you for the last 245 years. But they weren't winning. So he had to do it. And the Emancipation Proclamation was a military recruitment document. It didn't free all slaves. It only freed those slaves in the states, parishes, and counties that were in rebellion. How many of you have read the Emancipation Proclamation? I mean, it's a sin. How can you go through 8 years of elementary school and 4 years of high school and never read the Emancipation Proclamation? Every church at some point should read it in the church. But when you read the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln states, those counties, those parishes that were in rebellion. So if you were enslaved in any of those places and you could escape to Union lines, you would be declared free. Now, here's the kicker. There were states in the Union that had slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't free their slaves, even though they were in the Union. But nonetheless, black men answered the call. 220,000 black men joined the Union forces. 186,000 joined the Union Army. And they acquitted themselves so well that even during that racist period, 36 received Congressional Medals of Honor for their valor on the battlefield. 186,000. 60,000 killed. I'm talking about the black soldiers. 60,000 killed. 100,000 wounded. You saw that movie, Glory, when they were pushing the cart across the movie screen, and the cart was just full with pieces of human beings. Because back then, they didn't have the weapons that we had today. Back then, most of the soldiers, even though automatic rifles were on the scene, most of the soldiers had single-shot rifles. So most of that combat was hand-to-hand after the first shot. And in one battle, 30,000 would die at Antietam. In one battle, 25,000 would die in Gettysburg. And soldiers would write home and say, "Mama, I'm standing in rivers of blood." That's what it took to abolish slavery. And we must never forget the sacrifice that those soldiers made. And we need to honor them on Memorial Day and on Veterans Day. And you guys here in Central Jersey have a special place. Did you know that there's an African burial ground? Here, what's that little town between Princeton and Trenton? I can't think of the name right now. I'll think of it in a minute. No, it's not Lawrenceville. But there is an African burial ground there. Why is there an African burial ground there? It's something to ponder. Because segregation was from the cradle to the grave. Do you know why we don't have a system of universal health care in the United States today? It is because that this idea that there should be free health care is an idea that was put forward at the beginning of the 20th century. Teddy Roosevelt was one of the people. The Progressive Party, the Bull Moose Party, right, said we should have universal health care. And they didn't have the political power to make it happen at the beginning of the 20th century. So around after World War II, Harry Truman put forward the idea. But what happened? There was a group of senators. Malcolm X used to talk about them all the time. The Dixiecrats. Y'all remember the Dixiecrats? Strom Thurmond et al. The Dixiecrats. Truman wanted to create universal health care. But in doing so, that would mean that federal dollars would go to every hospital. And what would that do? That would federalize the hospitals. And what would that do? That would bring into effect federal law. The Dixiecrats said, we don't want universal health care, because if we get federal dollars, you're going to want us to admit Negroes to our hospitals. Because many of you don't remember that black women would die because they could not be taken to the hospital that was closest to them. If they were having problems in labor, if they were outside of a white hospital, a white segregated hospital, the law said that they had to be taken across the county to the Negro hospital. And if these women were having trouble in childbirth, many would die before they would get to the hospital. So we don't have universal health care because of racism. That's one of the reasons. There are other reasons, but that's one of the reasons. And this is a thing that, brothers and sisters, we all have to grasp, because at the root of many of the problems that we are trying to solve is racism. And we must get rid of, put in the trash can of history forever, the idea of superior and inferior races. There's one race, and that's the human race. Racism arose as an ideology to justify slavery. Do you know that white and black indentured servants made common cause in Bacon's Rebellion and other rebellions? But then they devised a tool to divide the indentured servants. And it took about 60 years. It didn't happen instantly. It took about 60 years to get being African coterminous with being enslaved. It took about 60 years for every one of the 13 colonies to pass that law that said If you were born of an African mother, you would be enslaved in perpetuity. Racism is not some mere flight of fancy. Racism is not a fad. Racism is not just a belief. It's a system. It's a system. It's an ideology, and yet it's a system that has material force to it, material basis to it, that continues to divide this country. And it will divide this country at the country's peril. Because America today stands at the crossroads. We're looking at two paths. We're looking at a path that the ultra-right in this country represents, that would take us back 100 years, take us back, that would reverse 100 years of social progress. And we're looking at a path that many might find difficult to accept, but it must be the future if America is to succeed, that we become a multiracial